Hello, Helen. Welcome to Rendering Unconscious. It's so nice to see you again.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And I can't wait to hear all about your new book and how it came about.
Great. I know we were just chatting before because I was just saying you're much more experienced in writing this kind of book and especially in psychoanalysis. And it was a new um, endeavor for me, I guess. So it's been interesting and different in some ways, kind of like refreshing because it's quite different from what I usually do. But these things are quite an undertaking, I guess, even if it's a short book, but and it's sort of based on ideas. It's funny as well, you know, how you have these ideas cooking for like a long time before you
Mhm.
even realize they're kind of cooking. And I guess it actually sort of started in my some of my frustrations in undergrad when I was doing a literature degree. And we had a sort of film studies course, which was really interesting, but we touched very briefly on it was all sort of put together as this sort of psychoanalytic film theory, and you're like, oh, okay, this sounds really interesting. And I actually think I was starting to delve into questions of subjectivity kind of on my own, and it was all packaged as like Freudian Jung, all the same, or like as if it's sort of like in a sort of very positivistic, digestible way. And I think immediately I was like, is this right? Because it had and I know it was only sort of an undergraduate introductory course, but I guess I felt there was enough um, something that intrigued me there that sort of set me off being actually kind of personally very interested in Freud and Lacan. And even though I kind of left that institution soon after that, but there was always this sort of sense that maybe the stuff that had really, and it's interesting because I don't think I'm necessarily saying anything new at all in the book. And there's lots of people doing brilliant work in all sorts of ways related to film and psychoanalysis. But it's really about how I've seen this unfold, not only sort of in my undergraduate days, but as an actual practitioner, even more sort of intensely, this disconnect between what we're reading and talking about in psychoanalysis and how a lot of these terms um, get adopted in the practice. And it's really hard to articulate just how much some of these, and it's not that it's all wrong, and you can kind of see the lineage of some of these ideas and how they've kind of been picked up from one set of ideas and sort of mixed with another. But it's particularly how some of the really key signifiers in Lacan that are kind of really explosive and ambivalent and multiplicitous and contradictory come to be um, viewed in this really sort of received wisdom concrete way. And what I sort of always find frustrating is it's like, if this is how we see the sum total of Lacan, we're actually missing, if that's what it represents, we're actually missing this whole potentiality of how we can conceive a film, how we can read film, what film can teach us, and how we can actually make film. So this is sort of a little bit of a kind of um, attempted articulating some of those frustrations and maybe what we could reimagine psychoanalytic film as on mostly from that kind of practical approach, but also from a kind of theoretical approach.
Absolutely. And from a filmmaker's perspective, because you make films as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and it's interesting because it really is, hard, as I say, it's hard to articulate how much these ideas or certain ideas have caught on. So one term that is really big in film theory and film practice is gaze, but it's never gaze in the way that sort of a psychoanalyst might understand it, in this sort of a residue um, of intersubjectivity, as in the lack in desire, the lack in the visual field, returning the look to the looker. It's much more to do with it's always presented in this gendered way or in this sort of identity particularist way. So you have female gaze, male gaze, all these kinds of things, which could be interesting. And I would say that those terms, the way they are interpreted and the way they have become to understood, are much more Foucauldian than Lacanian.
Mhm.
But the thing that I find difficult is that people, it is just understood that this is what Lacan is. But it's actually kind of the opposite, because when we're talking about things like male gaze as it's come to be understood, and it's used in sort of shorthand, even in terms of if you're trying to get funding or something like that. And it's kind of interesting how the economics of filmmaking have come to require a lot of these intellectual legitimation mechanisms that, as I say, are not I would say Lacanian, because Lacan is actually quite antithetical to what we would see as like a neoliberal capitalist approach. So a lot of, Foucault was writing, in the middle to late 20th century about, manifest systems of power. And these are really important things to critique. But his approach, and he mentioned the word gaze. So he wrote a book, I believe, called about the medical gaze, and that's about in hospital settings, questions of manifest systems of power and subjectivity in that sense. But it was really that got brought into psychoanalytic film theory. And I think maybe some of the original texts in Lacan were never read, or they were interpreted through Foucault. And as I say, this is not necessarily a problem, because I think that's a worthy thing to look at is Foucault. But Lacan was doing something quite different, and I would argue much more explosive and much more, as I say, antithetical to the capitalist approach. And some of these terms, I mean, a lot of people have been writing about this recently. Dara Sheehan, who's a psychotherapist and social worker in New York, just published a really brilliant essay with us at Sublation Media, called Glittering Images. And she talks about how the same sort of trend has happened in therapy culture, where, we would probably understand therapy culture as quite different to psychoanalysis. And of course, this is not to say that all therapy culture is bad, and people have all sorts of subjective difficulties, and there's all sorts of ways of sort of navigating that. But the terms that come to be the received wisdom and the kind of confidence of critique can almost mystify the contradictions of the market, the very issues of the ideology of promise, of exclusion, of exception, which really engender a lot of the ways in which people are marginalized and used and abused in capitalism. So it can actually be a way that sort of these systems of power are actually lubricated. Because, in psychoanalysis and in the analyst's discourse, we're looking at maybe something that's more of a current, or bringing the contradictions of the world and of subjectivity, symbolizing those, and bearing in mind that subjectivity is always contradictory. And I think the ways that some of these terms have been adopted really turns the contradictions that were original to Freud, Lacan, and many other writers into a more oppositional logic that is more aligned with contemporary capitalism.
That makes perfect sense, and that's such a great way you've articulated it so well. I hadn't really thought of it that before. And the idea of the male gaze, it's so pervasive. And of course, it has its place, like you said, but it really loses something when you're talking about the psychoanalytic gaze. It can't be really boiled down to that so simply.
Absolutely, because it's almost like, there's a gaze. It's not even that it has to be a subject, because, in terms of the heritage from someone like Hegel, where substance is a subject, there's a lack in everything. So there might be a gaze-like interplay between an inanimate object and the subject. And I think what the mistake of the male gaze, or how it's even become understood, is that it's about potency rather than impotence. So gaze is pointing out the dialectic of subjectivity in everybody. And almost, if we're looking at, let's say, the different subjective buckets in Lacanian psychoanalysis, like the obsessive or the hysteric, even the hysteric will turn the contradiction of their subjectivity potentially into an oppositional, misguidedly whole and complete model. But the hysteric maybe is more aware of their own contradictions, and the obsessive will have a drive towards totality in perhaps a more total way. But the insight of gaze is that even the male, and if we say, obviously these things aren't tied to gender, but there is in culture a more, we can say that the obsessive is more quote unquote masculine, although that, another insight of psychoanalysis is that there is always this slippage between the signifier, but between, these structures, you can have a female obsessive, and you can have, even the question of gender and our material body, it's divided all the way down. So it's not so easy. And I think this is also the point, just always to remember in terms of language, is that it's always ambivalent and it never hits the nail on the head. And this is why we can have art and music and film in the first place. And it's even why we have subjectivity, or at least it's a symptom of our subjectivity, which is divided. But the male gaze sort of falls into the mistake of the obsessive in a sense, which is like the male is more potent and totalizing in their subjectivity. And I think the thing is, this is the mistake of the obsessive, right? Who needs to be hystericized. And the thing is, it's but yeah, this is the lie that needs to be exploded. So whilst it is obviously, especially in the middle 20th century and the films that a lot of people are referring to when some of these ideas really came into prevalence, it was important to talk about patriarchy in terms of how that was the one of the manifest symptoms of capitalism. You know, society has changed. One thing about capitalism is it's always evolving, and it's using new signifiers and new means of mediating systems of power and of convincing us it doesn't exist in the way that it actually does. And it is interesting. I don't think this is just unique to film and film studies, but a lot of the canonical ideas that really still hold prevalence, and I think this is to do with actually, you know, the capitalist structure in which we live. It's really hard for new ideas to be foregrounded. I think this is to do with the neoliberalization of the university, people's precarity. You know, people are scared to say certain things, I think, because people's positions in the economy and in terms of just getting an academic job is so difficult these days that you don't want to sort of, but all of these, every idea that becomes received will always have a contradiction within it and always needs to be tarried with, and the negation needs to be negated. And, you know, this is something that always needs to happen. So I sort of feel like a lot of the ideas that were perhaps more relevant in the 20th century need to be tarried with today in terms of our manifest form of the structures of power that exist. And I think it does look quite different. But it is tricky because I think a lot of these terms have precisely become the way in which, as like a defense against viewing and understanding the capitalist economy as it exists, which is kind of sad because it's wasn't supposed to be that way. But Zizek's written a lot about this idea of the critique of the critique. We always need to critique the critique because capitalism, historically, especially sort of more conservative interpretations of capitalism, have put forward as an ideological foil all sorts of things which you know do need to be critiqued and seem aspirational. So things like freedom, these master signifiers like democracy, freedom, meritocracy and stuff, which capitalism tells us that it's allowing us to achieve. But actually, because of its very logic, because of the quantum sort of inequalities within the capitalist economy, because of its underlying need to rely on an ideology of promise and exclusion, it can never offer us in its pure form. But sometimes the critique takes the lie of capitalism as the problem rather than the underlying structure which prevents those aspirations from being achieved. And if then it doesn't actually take into consideration both the base and the superstructure of the capitalist economy, it can end up replicating the same underlying economic currents, but using, as Dara used the term, glittering images to convince us that we've actually progressed. And as I say, the trick is, and this is where everything is always complex and contradictory, those critiques need to be made, but unless the ambivalence is always, you know, bravely tarried with, and this is why, you know, I think psychoanalysis is such a productive and important approach to our reality. Is it's, you know, I think I mentioned in the book that, you know, a successful psychoanalysis, unfortunately, you know, one of the issues is it's so expensive because of this, but it can take years, and a psychotherapist will be doing their own analysis always. These are things that always need to be discussed and opened up because there is always an ambivalence within the signifier. So I guess, yeah, this is just an attempt to, and I don't want to, there are some conclusions I come to in the book in terms of what a sort of psychoanalytic film might look like, or the ways in which we might interpret different films. But I think the question is that, you know, I mean, this is maybe a cop-out, but one's words never achieve, you know, a word never says what it, I can't, it never hits the nail on the head, as I've always said. So, you know, even the book that any attempt that you make needs to be tarried with, but it is, I think the question is always to question our assumptions and to reintroduce that ambivalence. And especially, I
100%.
think, especially when there is this confidence of critique and that it's righteous and it's the right thing to do. Because I think the way that I see it in how the film economy has come to coalesce around some of these ideas, you can actually see that these maybe are a cover story for something more egregious going on sometimes.
Absolutely. What are some of your favorite films to critique or your favorite filmmakers right now?
Well, I mean, I would say my favorite filmmaker has always been Pedro Almodovar. And I actually was really lucky when I was about 16, 15, 16. I went on this like course for children, for young people interested in studying Spanish. And it was like a week, and I got to miss school for a week, and it was like great. And there were these young academics who were introduced. I think I'd been always been really interested in learning languages, and it was the first time that I'd really thought about, you know, the literary production from linguistic culture. And one of the things we did was we watched all About My Mother by Pedro Almodovar. And I was like, this is incredible. And I don't know, it really, really hit me. And at the time, I never really thought like I would be a filmmaker or anything like that, but that really set off an interest in film. Also, partly in a really cheeky way, as I ended up doing a languages degree at uni, is I sort of realized that we were just talking earlier about watching the same film over and over again. And my parents had like one French VHS. It's really melodramatic film about like from like the Musketeers era, but I probably watched that burned through that VHS because watching a film in a foreign language is a really easy way to, you know, improve your linguistic skills. So I just watched loads of movies and then, yeah. But Almodovar is someone who I've always found really interesting, partly because of the way he became a filmmaker, but also sort of the topics and ideas he's dealing with. And I think film is a really good vehicle to explore desire, and his films, and it's funny, his production company is actually called El Deseo, Desire. So it's and it's all, you know, his films often feature, and this is interesting because he was coming out of like fascist Spain in the 20th century. And a lot of his films navigate, you know, questions of the LGBT community in Spain at the time and gender and all these kinds of things. But it's really not in any kind of oppositional or puritanical way. It's very open, it's very explosive, it's very funny, it's often very scatological and ridiculous, which is something that I think really marks human desire and sexuality. And you know, some of his films that I mean are really beautiful and unique. And it actually took quite a long time. It was I know you're from Miami, but it was the Miami Film Festival that first kind of really legitimized him. So he'd made a lot of really low budget films. And I can't remember which one, but he had a film or a retrospective at a certain point in his career at the Miami Film Festival. And then he sort of became much more well known.
Oh,
But
good.
he's really brilliant. But yeah, I mean, loads of, I really like Haneke. I really like a contemporary filmmaker I think is fantastic is Denis Villeneuve, who's done loads of Hollywood movies. He did Dune. But some of his films, there was an early film of his, or a relatively early film, which I think he's a French language filmmaker from Montreal and or Quebec. I'm not sure if it's Montreal, but like the film um, really transported him into sort of like wider outside of, you know, world cinema, even though world is like the global term, into sort of more of the like Hollywood model. And I actually am blanking on the name of the film, but it's absolutely brilliant. Oh
It's
damn.
okay. We can look it up.
Let me just see. This is like
That's
not my
why I don't
expert
do it
self.
live. We
Do
can
it
look it up.
live. It's Incendie. It's an amazing film. I think it was originally a play, but it really is about we're talking about family history and lineage, and it's about a traumatic family history that two young people discover about their mother, who is an immigrant to Quebec. And it really is houses a deep enigma within it, and the way it's put together is just absolutely fantastic. I'm just wondering who else is. I mean, I absolutely love Claire Denis. She's still going. She just seemed to have joined Instagram, which seems cool. But
Hmm.
she's fantastic. I haven't kept abreast so much of her like most recent. I didn't ever see High Life, but
I
maybe it's
liked it.
did you? Yeah, yeah. Maybe it's because I have, sometimes you have like such somebody represents so much to you that then you don't want to like spoil it if you're disappointed by something. There's a film from 2008 with 35 shots of rum, which I just think is it's about the relationship with between a father and a daughter sort of graduating to adulthood. She's a student at a university, and there's a younger guy who wants to be in a relationship with her, and it's about the father who's at the point of retirement, kind of letting go of his relationship with his daughter. And it's absolutely beautiful film. So, yeah, I don't know. What about you? Do you have any kind of contemporary filmmakers that you're really into?
Yeah, but I was just thinking too, like I feel like all of these cultures, filmmakers and cultures that they come from kind of
Yeah,
understand psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic ideas, which is
absolutely.
just kind of like life and how humans function better than
Yeah,
like the Hollywood system, for example, which I really
but
don't see why it should be the gold standard anymore because all they do is throw out Marvel movies at this point, with like egregious product placement. So
my God, it's so. I mean, I actually feel terrible because they really have dug their own grave. And from a kind of one thing that is kind of tragic that I don't think is really well known is basically in Europe we have historically had these governing bodies that celebrate. Well, they were originally developed to celebrate, and I actually don't know the real history because I think they emerged often in like the late 70s when there was a real sudden boom, potentially because of an economic crisis, in small independent films. But these governing bodies in the UK are one is the BFI were developed to sustain and support art house films and stuff like that. But there was a switch probably around the banking crisis, where I think economically, globally, there's been a switch to constant too big to fail bailouts, where governments, I mean, it's sort of like a state sponsored trickle down corporate socialism. Um, and it's partly, I think, also to do with capital mobility, that it's really hard for governments to tax wealth and corporate wealth, which means that these corporations become more powerful and wealthy than the states themselves. And the
Mhm.
states then find themselves in this deferential position where they have to um, give loads of grants and tax breaks even further. It's this vicious, negative, vicious cycle to these corporations. And what they have done in the UK is give a lot of incentives for American corporations to film in Europe or in the UK. And I don't know how long it will go on because eventually that might run out and they'll just go somewhere else. And it has had an effect on these governing bodies focusing on that rather than independent film has really had an effect on the facility by which people can actually compete with these massive corporations. Just an example is if you have a huge HBO show filming in your local area, you can't get crew, you can't get. There was one time in Ireland where we were trying to make a music video in a very specific form of that. Basically, when you are creating an image, often cinematographers like to create a sort of haze to create a kind of depth and texture to an image. Every hazer on the island of Ireland was taken up by one production, that kind of thing. But actually, what has happened is workers in the US are missing out. So one of the issues with the strikes that happened a couple of years ago, and I think there was this feeling that this was going to be a moment where film workers would take back control. But I actually think that unfortunately the economic reality is even worse than we could possibly have imagined. But film workers are and cities like Los Angeles, like many major cities around the world, are becoming more and more expensive. And it's impossible for film workers to survive in America. So this, I do think, will have a massive impact on Hollywood as the epicenter of filmmaking. And as you say, this one of the I talk about in the book is this Hegel's passage on the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit, and this is really to do with the crisis that occurs when you reject the contradictory subjectivity or the other, or contradiction itself, the potentiality of risk. And as if you look at just outside filmmaking graphs on the global rate of profit, it's basically zero. And we do have this massive crisis in capitalism, I think, that's being put off by this bailout culture. But a lot of productions and studios are mitigating risk by rejecting novelty. But of
Mm.
course, what then happens is the risk is really where also the reward is. It's the potentiality, the unknown is also the potentiality. So you have this repetitive guarantee, but it's actually collapsing, onto its own contradictions. It becomes, that there's the attempt to annihilate contradiction and risk is the very thing that destroys the culture itself. And so as you say, these Marvel movies are just ridiculous. And a political theorist who's a really brilliant writer, Benjamin Studebaker, has talked about how a lot of people are dealing with the crisis in the economy in different ways, turning to family, and another one is fandoms. And I think that basically Marvel, it's no longer like a film production studio in the traditional sense of what a film is. And I think we talk about in the book how film could be, and often is in the history of film, a place where you are confronted with the contradictions of your desire or novelty or the subjectivity of the other. And because of the technology of film, it has this facility to do this in this really interesting, explosive way. But you actually maybe go to a Marvel movie, not for the experience of film in a traditional sense, but sort of an affirmation and a reassurance of one's own identity and desires relative to the ways in which we're coping with the difficulties of the world that we live in, the way in which, civil society has been undermined by, just on a basic economic level in the UK, all of the local governments are going bankrupt because people aren't earning enough to be taxed to finance these, local governments. And then the governments themselves aren't taxing the rich because of capital mobility. People can just move around. And also these corporations aren't being taxed. So these are all going bankrupt. So all of these, social services, community things, they're all going to seed. And film potentially, I mean, this is maybe a last gasp, could be seen as this more communitarian art form where we can convene and consolate and reimagine sort of the community experience potentially. But, I think a lot of people are really at a loss, and maybe we're kind of falling into this sort of PTSD type reactive logic where we're clinging to lots of signifiers, like maybe the male gaze or whatever, where we fall into a sort of oppositional logic where we can, instead of tarrying with the really difficult reality of our society, we imagine a utopia that soothes us. But because we live in a, complex, well, a contradictory reality born of the Big Bang, there's no such thing as a perfect world. There's no utopia because we need the contradiction to generate life and reality. I mean, this is something that's very foundational to the development of subjectivity in psychoanalysis. It's the failure of our parents that generates the potentiality of us actually being subjects, and the failure of language that actually generates the language itself. But we start to require enemies who, and this is, we see this play out and Hegel's really good at delineating this, but, obviously a good example in the early to mid 20th century Middle Europe is the forms of fascism that we saw emerge. But you start to require a contingent other who is the scapegoat, who stands in the way of the perfect utopia, but sustains its image in their shadow. And we do see that, and a lot of this sort of totalitarian, this group has some transcendent essence of totality. We elevate and debase in terms of racism and Orientalism and this kind of thing, not seeing, actually, in fact, we come from a contradiction itself, and every subject, thinking, speaking, or even not, overwritten by the signifier, is divided. And I do think film, because of its very structure, is able to remind us of that. But it's really sad when you see, films like the Marvels movies that are more about affirmation than a confrontation with gaze, with the structure of desire, and with the structure of subjectivity. And actually, my husband's just written a book about how we see this in comedy, how comedy is often gone from, laughter being bubbling up of anxiety, of something that binds us in terms of maybe something base and scatological, or maybe something, about the difficulties of being human, to a logic of affirmation, where sometimes we laugh at things precisely because we agree with it, and we imagine that there is some bad, crazy other who is the problem, who doesn't agree with us. And so often, we're kind of engaging in art in this more sort of oppositional kind of, I call it annoyment, and I'm very guilty of it myself, sort of that kind of negative jouissance where it's affirmative rather than confronting or even consolating about the difficulties of the human experience. And it is true, capitalism benefits individuals in all sorts of different ways, but it is a system in which even the winners lose. It relies on a promise of oneness and alterity that is available to no one. And I think that the structure of film itself can, in small doses, even we talked a little bit about world cinema, and you're right about, potentially there's going to be a shift away from, and I think there already is, the fact that, you have films like Parasite winning the Oscar. It's an absolutely brilliant film. But also, has been an embrace, maybe with the streaming services, which have a real negative impact economically, but in other ways, there are other sort of things that are sort of working. But with subtitles and stuff, I mean, I watch all my films, even in English, with subtitles. I don't know why it's sort of the way I watch films now, but I think a lot of people do. But yeah, that there is this potential recognition. The fact, this is like a really basic insight, but the fact that we can even identify as, let's say, if we are a 15-year-old American girl with a 70-year-old Asian man, that this speaks to, the possibility of us to do transference, which is a really fundamental tenet of psychoanalysis. But transference relies on a sort of meeting of the minds of, in terms of intersubjectivity and, a projection of imagined totality on the other, but then also, in terms of countertransference, in terms of the letting down of that subject, recognizing in the other their divided status. And I think that film, going on a journey with another subject, allows us to sort of witness the lack in the other's desire. And I think film is, just in terms of the way that it happened to develop, in terms of its sound design, that it's viewed with, a mass of people, and it has a mass of participants making it. The way that, obviously there's very clearly callbacks to the mirror stage in terms of the way that we relate to the characters on screen. But in terms of its structure and the way that it mobilizes desire, I think, compared to other art forms, although other art forms are able to do this in so many different ways. And I think one of the definitions of art is, an object or a phenomenon or a process that allows us to confront the contradictions in reality, is ambivalent. As soon as it's not ambivalent, it becomes sort of propaganda in a sense. But I think film is able to do this at the level of desire in a really interesting way.
Absolutely. And yes, one of my favorite films of recent years is Brandon Cronenberg's Infinity Pool.
Oh, is it good? I haven't seen it. Is
Oh
it good? I
my
mean, I'm a massive
God. I've
David
watched
Cronenberg.
it like
Yeah.
6 times.
Really? I need to see it. I need to see it because sometimes, it's interesting because he's David Cronenberg's son, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know, because sometimes you're like, you don't want to imagine, this whole Nepo baby phenomenon, which I think is actually kind of an interesting sign of the way our economy functions. But sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's brilliant. But yeah, did you ever see Maps to the Stars, David
Mm-hmm.
Cronenberg? I feel like that film really did not catch on.
It's so
And I
good.
actually really need to watch it again this week. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Because we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about some of Cronenberg's like older films like Videodrome and stuff recently, and I was just trying to defend the later Cronenberg because I think it's actually quite good. But yeah, I need to check out Infinity Pool. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And um my husband and I have been going on these like kicks where we'll watch kind of like either all one director's
Yeah,
films or like all films. Like right now we're doing like Dracula films because I'd actually never seen the original like 1931 Bela Lugosi Dracula.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So my husband's like, we need to fix this. So now we're watching Nosferatu and Vampire and like going through all of them. And then I told him, well, we have to also watch then the Bram Stoker Francis Ford Coppola. And he's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
no. And I was like, yes, you have to watch it too. He doesn't
It's a
want
film that
to,
just
but he
came
has
out.
to.
Yeah, no, definitely. There was a film that came out, I think a couple of years ago, and it was in production for like a long time, and it sounded amazing. But I think it didn't really do very well. And I'm not like that familiar with the whole the whole history of, you know, that kind of universe, the vampire Dracula universe. But it's like it's called the Voyage of Demeter, I think. And basically it's a group of people on a ship, and then I don't know which vampire, whether
They start disappearing.
yeah, exactly. It sounds really good, but apparently it was a bit of a flop. But maybe you'd have to. Well, it had some really good actors in it, and it sounds like a really good concept. It was one of those films that, like, yeah, I don't know why. It'll be interesting to see it, and then you can kind of see why it failed. But yeah, no, it sounds
I'll add
interesting.
it to our list for this one. I also want to watch all the like classic monster films because I actually haven't seen them. It's like I realize all these things, you know what they are because they're in the culture, but it's like,
Yeah,
have I
yeah,
actually ever seen The Mummy? Have I actually ever seen Frankenstein? Like, when would I have seen it? You know, I didn't grow up with streaming
that's
and things.
true.
Like, they played things like on TV, but it was more like Nightmare on Elm Street and like
Yeah,
Chucky.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it was the
yeah, yeah.
80s, you know? So it's like, when would I have actually seen these films? I don't think I've actually seen them. And my husband has like a monster film box set or whatever. So we're gonna watch all of those for October. But we
Yeah.
watched all the Cronenbergs, and it was really fun because we watched his newest movie and his very first film that was like
Oh,
clearly like right when he got out of film school or like during
yeah,
film school because it was like so film school. It was like so psychoanalytic. It was great.
yeah.
But it's interesting because he's basically kind of dealing with the same themes and concepts like all the way through. He's like very consistent in his, it's clearly like his art form. You know, he's like a real
Yeah,
artist
it's
in that
really
way where
funny
he's
when you actually
burning through
see this.
something.
No, exactly, because somebody's just got like some subjective issue that they're tarrying with, and you know, I definitely have. It's funny how you're sometimes confronted with your symptom and like the fact that you like really just obviously enjoy revolving around the same thing. But I realized in taking on a project recently that like even though I'd done analysis for a number of years and like I was so sure that this was not going to be an issue for me, the same thing keeps playing out. But definitely in my own films, every single film I do, and this is totally not conscious, ends with the character in front of a massive body of water. Every single one. And I'm like, what is this? But I guess all of my films end with this sort of like, well, I mean, I don't know if it's conscious or not, but this sort of like openness and this unresolved and this big sort of, but I have such an anxiety about the sea. I have total, what should you say, thalassophobia. And when I was like a child and an infant, my parents would try to like get me to swim or get me into pools, and I would have like a total panic attack and be like, ah. But it's funny, like every single one of my films, it's like I did one film about sea swimming, and I got my sister actually to swim in the sea because I was like, I'm not doing it. But yeah, no, every single character, and even a project that I produced and co-wrote, I didn't actually direct it. The last shot is the main character in front of a body of water. I'm like, what is this?
I
Yeah,
love that.
mystery.
I'm also terrified of the sea, so I understand. I'm okay like by the
Yeah,
shore. Like I could go
yeah, yeah,
swim in an ocean. I used to swim a lot from Miami. But like
yeah.
if I can't see where the land is, like forget it. Forget it. It's a complete panic. And I always
No, I mean,
attributed to it. My dad was he always says he wasn't in Vietnam, but he was drafted in the Vietnam era right out of high
right,
school and he went
right.
into the Navy. And he was a submarine sailor. So like I just attributed to like being like I've taken his trauma because he's like, yeah, he would be out to sea for like 5 months or something and like this metal tube underwater. It's like so insane.
No, the submarine is just like what I know.
Like
My
what a nightmare.
granddad, absolutely. I know. I have to say, just my grandfather was in. I think he did because he was like maybe 17 or 18 the first year of World War II, and he was in the Atlantic convoys for like the whole what, like 5 6 years, and he was really traumatized. So maybe it was like his stories. I mean, he used to like he was quite a serious guy, and occasionally, you know, you'd be like, oh, he'd sit you down and tell you about things. And it's like, fuck. Um, but no, it's I have to say Miami though, that's like shark waters.
Lots of sharks. Yeah, you don't think about that. Well, I didn't think about that when I was like 15. Now I would.
No.
But no, we used to like, yeah, skip school and go to South Beach and go skinny dipping or whatever. And
Yeah,
it was much more carefree then. But South Beach
it
also
wasn't
wasn't
it?
like a destination in the 90s. It was
Really?
like, not in the early 90s anyway.
Yeah.
No, it was like all old retired Jewish people and
Yeah.
like yeah places where people like shut up drugs, you know, like not in a fun party way, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, in a sort of depressing,
Yeah,
you know,
like derelict. It
dangerous
was pretty
way.
derelict in the early 90s
Wow.
still, which is interesting, and now it's like such a hot spot.
It is
Even the only reason to like there's like a strip on Ocean Drive that has all the Art Deco buildings,
yeah,
and like they would have torn those down a long time ago, but there was like one woman. I love how it just takes one person who was like,
yeah,
no, we have to save these, and she like worked her whole life like making sure it was made historic so that
yeah.
wouldn't rip it down because it's like oceanfront property. They would completely build these like huge like skyrise like Trump Tower kind of things like they have up the beach more on the rest of the beach. It's
That's
like
so
that.
interesting because it
Yeah,
is these iconic 1930s buildings in Miami that are so
they're
precious.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it used to all be that way. And there was like these great motels because they had like the mob, like the gangsters down there, like going to Cuba and stuff, like in the 40s and 50s and stuff like that. And they built like a string of motels where they still like have kept some of the ornamentation or facades, but they've knocked them all down and they're like these huge skyscrapers now. But they used to be these like two-story like motels and they all had different
yeah,
themes. And they were like, it's like the 40s and 50s where they're like imagining the future.
yeah, yeah,
And they were
yeah.
so cool and I wish they were still there, but they knocked them all down.
No, it's depressing, these sort of high rises. I know I have a friend who loves high rises and only lives in high rises, and he's very much somebody who's got his head in the clouds. No,
Yeah,
it's
they are
terrifying.
not for me. So
No,
where
but I
can
always
people
want,
see your films? Now I want to see your films.
yeah, I mean, I actually have a lot online now. I just put a whole bunch on my website. Not all of the stuff because I mean, what is quite funny is just quite how the film industry has collapsed over the last 2 years. It's sort of tragic and one has to laugh, but then, who knows what the future holds. But so a couple of projects are still with organizations and may yet be released. But it's really hard to place stuff at the moment. So either those other films will be released or they won't, and I'll eventually put them online. But I have a lot of my back catalogue of short films online. And yeah, I have actually, I think I just put on my Substack the first short film I made, which was we actually shot it in September 2014, which feels weird because I mean, I guess it's not that long ago, but it feels like a long time ago.
10 years
But that,
ago.
yeah. Sorry?
It's 10 years ago.
Is it 10 years ago? Yeah, yeah. But I did really like that the first film I made. I mean, I guess it was like um, the first thing you do, you don't have much budget or whatever, but you maybe have an idea brewing for a long time. So it kind of comes out. But yeah, no, and yeah, we're actually just in January, hopefully going to be filming a film that I first sort of conceived of and wrote 10 years ago. This is how long it takes to sort of, and it's funny because sometimes I'll have, friends and colleagues ask for help in terms of producing their work or their ideas. And it's really hard to communicate to people, I think, because you can't quite imagine why somebody would have such a deluded sickness to participate in this industry, that they'd wait out, that they have such compulsion to make film that they'd wait out like so long and be so disappointed for so long to like make the thing. But I always feel bad because it's like, well, yeah, we can do it, but it might take 10 years. But anyway, so this film, yeah, and it's actually kind of a reinterpretation of The Outsider by Camus, set in contemporary Belfast. And it revolves around questions of um, actually, it's a lot about social media and the fraying of sort of the fabric of society, how this affects subjectivity, double justice, the contradictions of somebody being guilty of something, but also the sort of, because of the structure of subjectivity and the swarm of the kind of collective in their striving for a oneness and alterity, or the belief that there is a whole and complete answer, how this can lead to the sort of, yeah, it's not just double justice, but it's how one can become guilty of something, but then also the victim of almost the crime of society to project, or to turn somebody into a scapegoat. So it really is all about kind of that ambivalence, and looking at how subjectivity in contemporary society is worth thinking about in terms of the way that we relate to each other mediated via the screens of social media. And it's actually, because it's a interpretation of a novel, we're kind of trying to do something interesting with this question of adaptation. So it's structured like a documentary, but within it has a reenactment of a series of events. But in reality, the main character of the film is also, so it revolves around the main character of the film is a guard on an army base in Northern Ireland. And so there's a whole question of the history of and the politics of the province in relation to that. But in reality, the actual actor is also a guard on an army base in North Belfast. So it's sort of, there's all these questions of reality and fiction. So it should be fun. It should be fun. And I actually kind of feel lucky because we're doing it with like really, really low budget. But one of the things that's fantastic about Northern Ireland is partly because of the way in which our governments have given American corporations so much money to come and film in that area. The crew is like really skilled and really brilliant. So we'll be working with a really brilliant cinematographer called Aidan Gold, who's a young guy, he's fantastic. But
wasn't Game of Thrones filmed up there?
yeah, it was. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So yeah, and it should we're filming it over sort of staggered, but it should be really fun. It should be really fun. And my husband and I also are finishing a documentary about, he was a friend of ours who is this absolutely fantastic man. Unfortunately, he died last year. And at the time of his death, he was one of the longest, if not the longest surviving person in America with AIDS. And he was a religious minister. And this film is about, it's a sort of celebration of this guy's life and legacy, Steve Peters, but also a question of AIDS memorial now that that generation is sort of passing away. And it's really interesting. You were talking about your father being drafted. That generation in America, so Steve graduated from high school in 1970, I believe, 1969. And we actually interviewed one of his friends he went to a boarding school on the East Coast. What it was like to be a teenager at that time is absolutely crazy.
Mm.
And we talk about, yeah, the cultural questions in America at the moment. I mean, obviously we live in a really, really fraught time, but the anxiety of that epoch and the cultural changes, you know, for the older generation, how confronting that was. And for the younger generation who had this, you know, Vietnam hanging over their heads is absolutely crazy. So it's always interesting when you're doing a documentary how, I mean, it's not surprising. Everybody's life is, you know, the world we live in is really fascinating and people live through such fascinating things. And I guess it's a question as well to return back to some of the maybe identity political ideas or signifiers that have come to dominate society is I think when these ideas like the personal is political came about, the question was political, if we refer it back to the history of philosophy and psychoanalysis, is about what is political, is that which is ambivalent and universal, and in terms of the lack that marks all subjects. And politics is, you know, in maybe a sort of one philosophical interpretation is about how a collective of two or more people navigate the reality of living in a commons with people who are infinitely complex and contradictory precisely because of the way that subjectivity is generated by our material bodily structures, as psychoanalysis shows us, and how we will have contradictory desires, and we have to navigate that. So the question of looking at particulars, which I think was a real trend in sort of middle to late 20th century critical theory, and an important step, was to lead from the particular back to the universal, so that the particular experience shows us just how infinite and contradictory subjectivity can be because of its very structure. And this leads us into some kind of insight about the collective world, the structure of society, building a more equitable society. But what often happens today is the particular becomes a commodity in and of itself. So we are sort of pitted against each other as a collection of identities that can be racked up, or as a sense that somebody is essentially different. So it's not and I go into this quite a lot in the book, it's like the identity itself is a response or a symptom of, as Tom McGowan has written about this fantastically, you know, for many years, the structure of subjectivity which is lacking. So the lack is a prism which can generate an infinite possibility. So I feel like these ideas, and I think actually, you know, a documentary about an individual is a reminder of this, that there is always something universal within the particular. And the way in which I think neoliberal society would rather arrest the particular. So there's no lack, there is only loss, which is contingent. So somebody says suffered contingently in a way that is, and because, you know, this is also something that I think is really important to point out. And I really love the way Zizek has these examples. You know, one can be a hypochondriac and have cancer. One can be, you know, deludedly and toxically jealous of a partner who is also cheating. Material reality does exist, and this is absolutely something that needs to be tarried with and negotiated, particularly in the way we organize society in terms of the economy and politics and systems of power. But also because of the structure of subjectivity, sometimes those very real phenomena can be used as a defense against arriving at a philosophical understanding that could generate a better way of organizing society that would lessen some of the more egregious forms of systems of power. And I think potentially one of the differences between the society that existed when some of these ideas were coming about and our society is that capitalism is more pervasive and mystified. And the logic of capitalism is quite difficult for us to overcome. It's really sticky. It's sort of, you know, as Todd writes about this so brilliantly in Capitalism and Desire, it really responds to the denaturedness of our subjectivity. It's soothing in the short term, egregiously, you know, destructive in the long term. But it tells us that the lack we experience as human subjects, which is ontological, necessary for us to even exist, can be assuaged by a commodity, a phenomenon, you know, a religious thing that we invest in. And I think sometimes it's really hard for us to step outside of that. And reality, we can see examples of reality always there to affirm our capitalist delusions in a sense. So I think this is why the analytic method is so important, because it's not about consciousness raising. It's, you know, the way that reality is, you know, happens to be, the universe in which we happen to live is structured, is that there is always the slippage between matter and the way we view matter as human subjects. And that, what is so important about psychoanalysis is it reminds us of, and this is what this question of gaze does. Gaze is a reminder of our lack as subjects and our desire, the fact that we are desiring subjects. Also, you know, I always think about like Lacan, it's sort of this sort of net of ideas, and one idea leads to another. They all are born out of the same thing, but also each is an insight into our reality that is infinitely complex because of this fundamental idea. And analysis is really about that, you know, subjectivity and how it relates to the world in which we live. And I think it's always important for us to think about, to return to the analytic method. And, you know, Lacan writes in 1969, the Four Discourses, following what he sort of sees as some of the failures of the student protests in 1968. And he talks about the university discourse. And the university discourse, I would say, is similar to this confidence of critique that, you know, and this is not to say like there's so much brilliant work being done in universities all the time, but the more corporate the university becomes, the more tricky it is to actually embody the analytic method, because capitalism relies on a problem solution logic, which is antithetical to psychoanalysis. You know, it relies on, you know, the problem solution logic relies on the problem being contingent and there being a sort of a perfect solution that exists. But psychoanalysis would point out the imperfection in everything, and that being the place from which a more stable grounding for the way we think about and organize things can emerge. So, and I think, yeah, the more things become corporatized, the more the social fabric is frayed. I mean, obviously, social media has been, you know, we're always given something by the capitalist project that is enough to get us to believe that it's beneficial, because on social media, it's been so nice to connect with loads of different people and to, you know, connect with friends from childhood that you'd never see again or whatever. But it is the fact that so much of our social relations are mediated by the market and the structure of the promise, the ideology of promise, the fact that the other may have something that you don't, not on a material level, but on a transcendent religious sort of level. These are all things that, you know, destabilize us and maybe make us more reliant on an oppositional, totalitarian, reactive logic. And I think that's really antithetical to psychoanalysis. and that film potentially, who knows, if it's thought about in a certain way, but I sort of think it has something in the contingent way that it materially developed that resists this capitalist logic. And I think all art sort of does. And when it is, as you point out with Marvel, it just doesn't sit right as a film. I mean, that sounds like a really basic thing to say, but I think it works for people, not as film, but as something else. And it might be like a film-like entity, but yeah, we're losing the art of film maybe. But I do think lots of art and visual culture is so predominant, and young people especially are so well versed in the visual medium, that there is a potential that loads of brilliant art can be made. And I know that loads of brilliant work is being made, but there is a difficulty in the market bringing forward and distributing work that actually goes against the market logic. But it is precisely that which is the best art. So it is a real conundrum.
Yeah, I think that another filmer that Yorgos Lanthimos, the fact
Mm.
that like yeah, Emma Stone got the Oscar for Poor Things, that was kind of hopeful because his films are very weird
Very, it's
in the best
interesting.
way.
I chatted to somebody the other day, and it is still possible. Yeah, it's not so bleak because it is still possible. And as you said, like I think Parasite was a fantastic film. It's interesting because I think there is a possibility that some of the great directors who emerged at a given time when it was still possible. I think we're at this sort of real crisis point because of the way that streaming services have developed in terms of where we go from here in film. But it's almost what happens in film is that there is this sort of miraculous when something works and people like it and it makes studios money, it's almost a miracle. So there is this real fetish about people who've achieved the miracle, and then this repetitious sort of like reinvestment in that work. So in terms of streaming services, you see, especially in documentaries, there is a risk aversion in terms of who is given the job of directing. And often it's like there's a requirement in pre-production to find somebody who has an Oscar and an Emmy or a Golden Globe or something like that. So you have the same directors, you have about the same 10 people making all the projects. So it does get very boring. But then when you have these brilliant people like Yorgos Lanthimos potentially, who are in the place to be funded and make films, because they exist and they have sort of risen at a time when it was possible, or it was potentially miraculous that they existed, they are sort of for in a sort of the logic of the corporate executive of the studio. And I think it's even really difficult for someone like him to raise finances and to make the work he wants to. But it's almost like they embody the position of the master. And if there are enough existing masters, then maybe there's a potential for brilliant films to still exist. But it is true that then what you often get when you have such an investment in a master is sort of like a fetishistic level because of the instability of the market. Like you have people like Coppola with Megalopolis. He did have to finance it himself, but the fact that he accrued so much wealth from his other films maybe says that like there's a bit of an imbalance there. But yeah, no, it is still possible, and I believe in miracles because, and like I think it actually is like the most truly like atheistic thing, because it's like if we live in a complex and contradictory universe that comes from the Big Bang, comes from lag, there's always a possibility that something new is gonna emerge, because to not believe in, if you really believe in sort of like an all powerful deity, then it's not really a miracle if something miraculous happens because it's ordained. It's but I think contingency, and actually Quentin Meillassoux wrote a really interesting short book about a poem by Mallarmé, a French 19th century symbolist poet. I think it's called like The Mermaid and something, but the poem's called Un coup de dé, throw of the dice will never eliminate contingency. And yeah, it's basically about like there's always possibility to roll a double six. There was a really well-known podcaster who I have to say I had to stop listening to the podcast about 5 years ago because it sort of went off in a weird direction. But she used to say like, don't kill yourself because something, and then she used the R word, will happen. Because there's always something can come up. The universe can throw something up. So I do, and I think we need some miracles. We need help. But also
Especially to
maybe,
dismantle these corporations, like you said, that they've just yeah, more powerful than governments. There's a really
I know I really thought, I mean, I say that we need miracles, but we also do need to sort of rethink the way that we conceive of politics for us to actually take like universal action to do something. And it's sort of crazy. I don't see, without having some kind of international agreement or body to enforce tax on mobile capital, I just do not see our way out of it. And it's crazy,
Mm.
like, even, you know, like Elon Musk, it was early on in the sort of this moment in Israel Palestine, he sort of appointed himself as some kind of ambassador and was having like meetings with it. And you're like, this is just some rando who's like a corporate executive. How the hell has he got to the point of being so politically powerful because of his money to be an ambassador? It's absolutely crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it's
just crazy.
terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying. I mean, it really is. And I can actually see why, you know, it's no surprise that people fall into a soothing oppositional utopic logic
Yeah,
to
they need candy and popcorn in Marvel movies.
exactly because it's too scary to come. It really
So
is.
they
It
can just
really,
check out.
yeah, no, totally, totally. I know. God.
Unfortunately, when I see something that's supposed to make me check out, I actually leave because our town, we moved out of Stockholm into this
Yeah,
town of just 10,000 people. And like, we have a tiny cinema and we go to so many bad movies just because we wanted to stay open because it was closed when we moved here from
yeah,
COVID and we were so happy that it opened.
yeah,
Um, but I had to actually like I have to like actually be a little more choosy because they really only show like the mainstream movies. And
yeah.
I felt like I would leave and instead of just at first I'd be like, oh well, whatever, it doesn't hurt me to see a bad movie. But then I started realizing I think this is hurting me. Like this is making me dumber. And then I started having like existential crisis of like, is this really where like humanity is at? You know, like these are the movies that are coming out. Like I would come out like
But maybe it's, yeah, maybe it's a good thing to kind of to be aware.
I was like, yeah, I would like, yeah, I would go into like a depressive spiral when I would leave. And I'm like, I don't think going to the movies is supposed to make you feel like this.
I know.
Like,
I
I
have to
have
say,
to be
I'm
a
really
little
guilty though.
choosier.
I get real, and I call it annoyment, you know, where you, I mean, I guess it's just response, where you go and you get really like worked up about how shit something is. And I think it's because I know how it's so hard to get a film done at all in the independent space or just in capitalism at all. And then just seeing how bad things are. It's a real, it can become this whole thing where you start to, again, even though it is absolutely true that this is like the economy is absolutely terrible and it's creating conditions and these are a symbol of it, it can still embody for you the kind of oppositional utopic logic when like if only I had the ability to make films then my life would be great, if only these studios stopped, you know. But it is terrible, it's absolutely terrible, it really is. But as I say, sometimes, but you know, you actually look at years in film, like if you people should Google films that came out in 1999, it's like hundreds of great works,
Mhm.
hundreds. This was a couple of years before the Twin Towers. You know, this was a moment, I think, in American capitalism just before, you know, transformations occurred. And then obviously soon after that, we had the 2008. 2014 was quite a good year as well. But now, and I, you know, people haven't, obviously, I do think our subjectivity is transformed by our material conditions. So it really becomes more and more difficult to think outside. And the perverse, when, if I mean, it's really boring, but in terms of the way in which film is financed in Europe, in terms of the state run model, the perverse incentives, because again, it's the same risk aversive structure, even though the government funding for independent filmmakers is sort of more like a sort of, in a way, ideological foil, but a sort of goodly, benevolent philanthropy capitalism to sort of mitigate in the tiniest way against the egregious investment in American corporations. But the logic, there's still the capitalist logic, the problem solution logic, the risk averse logic exists. And often the risk aversion is related to that which is imagined to make the economic structure the most mystified or the most apparently goodly. So it's all to do with, you know, you have to operationalize your identity. Often you have to confess your traumas in the application so this is all cultural capital that
Mhm.
is adopted by, you know, the governing bodies to mystify what's really going on. And what has also happened is you have this proliferation, like in every industry, people go to university, loads of people went to film school, just as there was in capitalism, like a lack of reinvestment in roles and jobs in favor of profit. You know, there was a necessity, both a necessity and a material sense, to get people to university because there weren't enough jobs for them in the short term. and to get people in debt to raise more money for, you know, capitalism to mitigate against the falling rate of profit, but also to get people to invest in the promise that the conditions were overcomable in the future. And this is a real, you know, capitalist utopic fantasy that you can be the exception and it will work out for you. But I think a lot of people of my generation and younger are sort of realizing what a lie that is. But you have this mass proliferation of extremely talented people who actually have a lot of training. At the same time as lessening and lessening and lessening of the opportunities, precisely because of the economic model that's been invested in. And in terms of this philanthropy capitalism, what we have to go and cap in hand to sort of like the billionaire class, essentially, you have, you know, 10,000 people applying for 10 opportunities. And in that sense, how is a film ever going to be picked? It's almost like you might as well just throw something in the air and whoever, you know, whatever lands on the floor first should be, in a sense, that would be more fair than using this opportunity of the desperate surplus reserve army of artists to confess, to do the emotional labor of confessing. And it's interesting, you know, that emotional labor was an idea coined by, I can't remember her name, but an author who noticed the way in which air stewardesses had to operationalize their subjectivity in their role and had to exploit their own affect in their job. But there is a huge amount of emotional labor that we're forced to engage in terms of sounding and mining our own subjectival history and traumas as filmmakers, just even to get to the first line of getting funding. And then this puts it's a really perverse incentive, and it pits people against each other in a really weird way. And it is odd, and it's odd to sort of discuss and talk about, because if I showed people some of the forms that exist in terms of, people would be, it's almost, you know, when something new happens, and I can think of lots of examples in my life. I was having a conversation about this with a friend who runs a pizza restaurant, and she hires loads of young people, and when they're taking orders, sometimes the young people can't hear the name of the client because they've never heard it before. So even when somebody says, my name is Hugh, a younger person who's never heard the name before because it's, you know, of an older generation, literally can't hear it, can't imagine what the word actually is. But sometimes some of these new symptoms that come up in terms of the way that we manage capital and mediate power relationships is we don't see it at first because it's so novel and so weird. And so sometimes you see these things and you think, oh, this seems perfectly normal for me to write a 2,000-word essay about how I am especially a good person and how my, you know, it is very much the logic of loss rather than lack, that I have had a contingently bad experience, and this makes me makes me more proximate to an essential truth about the universe, that I can be in my position to dictate to people and to tell people, you know, how moral rectitude should really be in relation to. But there is no essence, there is no, as you know, as the concept of gaze reminds us, there is a lack at the heart. There is a real that resists symbolization. I mean, we can bring aspects to that which is not articulated into the symbolic order, but there's always something that resists. Contradiction persists, lack persists. There is no there. But it's really sad how it's our very subjectivity that is being commoditized. And I think this is a really difficult thing for us to navigate in terms of the social relation. I think this really does pit us all against each other, and it makes it more difficult to do a universalist politics, which I think in terms of the global shit show that we have created, we really need, you know. But yeah, but I think maybe, yeah, film at its best could maybe remind us of the things that we need to remember in order to embody a more universalist sort of outlook.
Oh, wonderful. And what's your website and Substack so people can find your films?
So my website is just helenrollins.com. And then my Substack, I think it's called, I set it up years ago and I don't post that often, but I do have some stuff up there. It's called Dialectical Materialist Girl.
Wonderful. No, that's what my husband does. He's a filmmaker as well,
Mm.
and he ended up taking them all off. He had Vimeo for a long time,
Yeah.
but he took them all off and put them all on Substack. And then people who like have paid subscriptions, they can see all his films and his lectures and
Yeah.
everything. He just uploaded it all to Substack, and they have like, I mean, a lot of bandwidth. You can really upload a lot of things there, so it's a really
Yeah,
good
Substack is
platform for
actually
that.
good. Yeah, it is actually. Yeah, it does. I wonder, a lot of these things they end up adhering to like eventually like the logic of capital in a really egregious way, but it does seem like a really good platform. And yeah, I always have an intention. But we were talking before about like there's always more that one feels one has to do.
Hmm.
It's like
It's endless.
endless. And then so you're like, I will write, I have loads of unfinished essays that I'm like, I will post, but I just
That's why you have to
very
also abandon a book at some point because you can keep editing it and adding things and rearranging things
true.
forever. And at some point, you just have to say, it's done.
Done. Yeah, it's enough. No, exactly. No, I always think like a good reminder is that there is perfection is impossible. It is impossible in this universe. And so, you always it's like Zizek's point with the woman who would be perfect if she lost 10 pounds, but it's precisely the 10 pounds that allows you to imagine perfection. So you always have to have the imperfection that allows you to enjoy the imaginary possibility of perfection. And you do it the next time. You give it another go.
Yeah, it's infinite. Well,
Yeah.
thanks so much for being here. It was lovely to chat with you, and you're welcome
That's
back anytime you have anything coming out. Just send me an email. And if you and
great.
Alfie want to come in and talk about all the things you're doing and his book that's coming up, just let me
Yeah,
know.
that would be great. I mean, we are doing we have a little press called Everyday Analysis that people might know, and we run sort of monthly reading groups in London. So if anyone's around London and wants to join the reading group, please join us at the Stapleton Hall Tavern in Finsbury Park, and we post on socials when it's going to be. And often the person who's written the most recent pamphlet gives a talk, but they sometimes can't get to us. But yeah, if anybody has any having said about like I've got so many unfinished like essays and stuff, but if anybody has any unfinished pieces of work that they would like published somewhere, we are open to all things psychoanalytic. So give us a shout.
Wonderful. Great. So we'll talk
Great.
again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa.
Bye.
Bye.